time to start and turn it over to Betty. Introduce Betty Darnell, who will introduce our speaker, Robin.
Robin McDonough has been a staff member in the History and Genealogy Department at the St. Louis County Library for 5 years. Prior to that, she was a high school history and geography teacher. She holds a BS in education from the University of Missouri-Columbia and an MS in education from Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville. Robin has been researching her family's genealogy for over 15 years, including her husband's Irish lines. We have all of you muted, so if you have questions, we would like you to post them in chat. Thank you for that. Robin?
Okay, all right. Well, hello, everyone. Let me go ahead and take a moment to share my screen with you. Welcome and hello to everyone. I'm so glad to be with you today. Just a little background. I was inspired to create this presentation after doing work on my husband's Irish ancestors, as well as through helping patrons that come into the St. Louis County Library doing Irish research. It seemed like many of them they were not aware that these records were out there. They did not know how to access them or how to use them to fill in their family trees. My hope is that when I am finished, you will have become a little more proficient in using these records. And if you are new to Irish research, I hope I can open a new door for you. We will be touching on several items today, including why these records are important, the history of the church and the records, what records are available and where to find them, what the records look like, identifying your parish, some tips and pitfalls that you may encounter, and a short case study showing how these records can be used. So, jumping right in, why are these records important? Well, civil records in Ireland, as many of you may know, for births, marriages, and deaths did not start until 1864. This, combined with the fact that most 19th century census records were destroyed, some by fire, some were destroyed purposely by the government. This means that we really have a shortage of records in Ireland. In the United States, the census records are really the backbone of our research, and we don't have that in Ireland. So the only record of existence for a large percentage of the Irish people are these Catholic Church registers. Since 33 million of us in the United States claim Irish heritage, it's great that we have these. So we have a way to explore our ancestors in Ireland. A little bit about the history of the church and the records, and a little bit about the famine thrown in there as well. So as far as church history is concerned, in the 5th century, Christianity arrived in Ireland. This is often associated with St. Patrick. Actually, it was a little bit before that, but roughly 5th century. In the 12th century, there was a reform to the Roman diocesan system, as well as the beginning of 800 years of English rule in Ireland. So what this means is, in 1534, when Henry VIII renounced the papacy, the Church of England, or the Church of Ireland in Ireland, became the official state church. Now, this had little effect on most people living in Ireland, but the Catholic Church was under constant threat. There were penal laws passed in the late 17th century that punished Catholics. They couldn't hold office, couldn't build schools, couldn't transfer land. Bishops were exiled, priests were made to register. But the Catholics kept practicing, sort of in disarray. The clergy was not always properly trained. Sacraments were sometimes poorly administered. And what affects us now is that the record keeping was definitely spotty. These penal laws were relaxed by the late 18th century, and they were all repealed by 1829. There was a rebuilding of the church after this, but of course, record keeping was still not quite a high priority. The state church was then eventually disestablished in 1871. Let's talk a little bit about the famine. So we know, meanwhile, we have all this going on with the Catholic Church, and then we have the famine striking in 1845. Spanish explorers had introduced the potato to Europe in the 16th century. By the 1840s, half of the Irish population's diet depended almost exclusively on the potato, which grew well in poor conditions, which is a lot of different parts of Ireland. Phytophthora infestans is what the disease was called, or late blight. And basically the crops rotted in the fields over the next several years. About 1 million died and about 2 million emigrated. And most of these were poor Catholic people. So again, they're emigrating, they're coming to the US. This is the only record of their existence. All right, as far as the history of the records, so the records were kept at individual parishes, but in 1949, the National Library of Ireland began microfilming all of the surviving Catholic registers to 1880. Once they were microfilmed, they were indexed by Roots Ireland. And in 2016, these records were given to other sites with the stipulation that they must be free to use. Okay, what records are available? So first of all, record keeping generally increased during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. There were a lot of issues with the church, but once those penal laws were starting to be relaxed, we have more record keeping coming in late 18th and early 19th centuries. There are regional variations, though. There are more for the provinces of Leinster and Munster. There are fewer registers for parishes in Connaught and Ulster, but there are some early registers found in all parts of the country. The oldest surviving Catholic parish register dates back to 1671, and it is from Wexford Town in County Wexford. Some parishes, unfortunately, have no records prior to the civil records. And a few parishes were not covered in the microfilming, but new records could always be uncovered. Records that have been kept in a church, in a parish somewhere that were not sent to be microfilmed could still be uncovered. This actually happened to a colleague of mine who was doing research on his Irish ancestors. When this first began, when the records first became available, the parish was not on there. The parish is now available. So that could definitely happen if you don't see yours. Okay, where do we find these records? Well, the first place that I like to go is actually ancestry.com. So the trick to this, though, is you must have a free guest account. So with all of these, there is free access, but you can't just go on Ancestry and see them. You do have to log in with a free guest account. And I don't think Ancestry makes it real easy to find on their website how to do this. So I just would put in your search bar, Ancestry free guest account, and I think it takes you right to that page in Ancestry. Or of course, if you already have an Ancestry subscription, or if you're using it through a library, you will have access to these. What you want to do is you want to go to that home page, should look familiar to everyone, and you're going to click on search and then click on card catalog. And then what I like to do is in the keyword box, I put Ireland, Catholic, and this always takes me right to those records, which are listed first right here. Ireland Catholic Parish Registers, 1655 to 1915. Now, actually, the earliest record does not actually go to 1655 because it is actually 1671, but that's okay. So if we click on that, this search page for Ancestry, I'm sure looks familiar. So you're going to utilize it just like you would be if you were looking for a census or anything else. You can also browse the collection as well. If you didn't want to search by name, you can pick a diocese, pick a parish, and you can search. Although there is a site that I actually like better for searching, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So another place that you can find these are on Find My Past. Same thing, you must have a free guest account. When you go on to Find My Past, you're going to want to scroll down the page to where it says Free Genealogy Records. And if you click on that and then click on Search Free Irish Records, and then we click on that, it will take us here. So you'll see we're searching in the baptisms, the burials, the marriages. We can search on just one of those if we want to, and we can search by name down here. So that's how we find them on Find My Past. And it's interesting because the same colleague who I said had found some parish records after he started working with them, he always uses Find My Past to find ancestors in these, and I almost always use Ancestry. So part of it, I think, is just maybe what you get used to, but they're both good sites to use. Okay, the National Library of Ireland at registers.nli.ie is where you find these, is a place that I like to go when I want to browse. So this website does not have the records searchable by name, but it is very easy to browse here. When would you want to browse? Well, if you're having trouble getting results either on Ancestry or Find My Past, you know, the name is just horribly misspelled in the record and it's just not coming up, and you know the parish and you know the approximate date, why not just browse those records? You might find some things that you weren't looking for. You might find some other siblings and things like that. So browsing can be very, very useful. So when you're on this site, you can, this is the main page of the Catholic Registers at the National Library of Ireland, and you can enter a parish name here if you know it, or you can scroll down. There's a map and you can click on the county, and then it will show you a map of all of the parishes within that county, and you can choose just a parish within the county. And then you'll have a page that looks like this, where you can choose the sacrament and the years that you're wanting to view. And in this case, we're going to look at these baptisms. And so the records are going to look like this. So again, you cannot search them by name, but you can make them larger and smaller, and you can go page by page. You can also filter through. So even though you can't look up by name, you can say, well, I want to look at baptisms from 1860, and it will take you to that area in the records. So again, browsing, very useful tool, and you can do that here at the National Library of Ireland. Okay, some other sites that you may want to consider, but I do not believe these have complete records. Roots Ireland, Irish Genealogy, as well as Family Search. And you could also always go visit your parish and look at the records in person. I like to put a smiley face there because that's what we'd all love to do. Those of us who are researching our Irish ancestors. Okay, what do these records look like? Let's talk about that for a moment. So there is usually no standard printed form, and there are a lot of variations among parishes and even among different years in the same parish. In records in the US and Catholic churches, you almost always see a standard printed form with columns and rows. You don't find that all that often in Ireland. You do find it in some of the churches, in I think some of the more urban areas is where I've seen these, but usually it's just the priest writing in on a blank piece of paper. And these records will be in English or in Latin. And they will consist of baptisms, marriages, and deaths. You won't find deaths for all of the parishes, but you will usually find baptisms and marriages. Okay, this is a typical baptism. It may contain the date, the child's name, the father's name, the mother's maiden name, the godparents or sponsors, and sometimes a place. Now, I do want to stress that this is best case scenario, okay? Oftentimes you will not find all of this, okay? So again, best case scenario. Let's pull one out just to take a look at a typical baptism. This is on the 16th, James of John Costello and Mary Ryan. Those are the parents. The sponsors were John Ryan and Betty Connell, and this baptism took place in Newtown. That is most likely a townland. Usually when I've seen places, it's oftentimes a townland. If you're new to Irish research and you're not familiar with what a townland is, it's the smallest sort of land designation in Ireland. And as you go through your Irish research, you'll start to hear that term more and more. So this is a typical Irish baptism. A marriage would consist of the date, the bride's and the groom's names, the witnesses, and sometimes the parents' names. So let's pull one out here. We have February 6th, Richard Osborne to Mary Riley, and she was a widow. The sponsors were Thomas Kerrigan and Mary Pentoni, and this marriage took place in Porterstown, and it looks like we also have the priest's name as well. So typical marriage, again, this one does not contain the parents' names. I have seen that, but it's probably more typical to not see them, unfortunately. Okay, so that's your typical marriage. A death record, very basic, date of interment, the name of the deceased, and sometimes a location. So just to pull one out here, November 30th, we have Martin Naughton, and he was from Craig. So pretty simple on those deaths. And again, you won't find the deaths in all of the parishes. Okay, how do you identify your parish? All right, a little bit on the geography of Ireland. Okay, there are 4 provinces that make up Ireland. There are 32 counties among those 4 provinces. And there are civil parishes, cities, towns, townlands, other things such as geographical markers, mountains, lakes, rivers, roads, all kinds of things like that found within those counties. As far as the church side of it, there are 26 Catholic dioceses, but there are over 1,000 Catholic parishes, okay? So those are starred because we want to find these in order to place them within a parish, okay? We want to find a town, we want to find a townland, we want to find some kind of geographical marker, or the best would be if we just outright knew the parish, but oftentimes that doesn't happen. So we want to find these smaller designations that we can put into a parish, and then we know to go check those parish records. Now, the question is always, how do we find that? Well, for those of you doing, those of you who have done European research, whether it's German or Italian or Irish, whatever it is, the key is always finding the place that they were from specifically. Those of you who have done German research know that Prussia is not enough. It's the same thing with Ireland. Galway may not be enough. But what can we do? Well, first we want to exhaust all of the records that we have in the US to see if anything was mentioned about where exactly the ancestors were from. This particular slide that I have up here, I first want to talk about as one of the ways to find out this information is family lore. Just talking to relatives, see if they remember any other relatives ever mentioning where the people were from. In this case, this is actually a text from my phone from several years ago where I was texting with my husband's uncle about where his ancestors were from in Ireland. And he mentions he says, but we know he was born in Glan. Okay, and then he also mentions he heard them mentioning Connemara. Well, Connemara is the western part of Galway, so that places them in Galway. Now, Glan was sort of a mystery. Glan, as far as when I was first figuring this out, was not a town. It was not a townland. I didn't know what it was, but I put it in Google Maps, and apparently it's a road. There's a Glan Road, and then there's also just informally a Glan Valley, which is where oftentimes these people would say they were from. So once I was able to figure that out, I put them in the proper parish, and I did find them in the parish records. So I had to do a little bit of digging and a little bit of out of the box work, but I was able to find it. So family lore is one of the best ways that you can find this information. I also want to mention that he points out that when the immigrant, this was William McDonough in this case, when he first got to the US, he stayed with Mike Malloy in New York. And I just want you to file that name Malloy away, because that's going to come back a little bit later in some of the Irish records. So family lore, great way to try to find the parish. A tombstone. So the Irish were actually pretty good about putting their locations on their tombstones. So in this case, we have a tombstone for Patrick Kelly. He was born in County Clare. Now, you're probably not going to be able to find Patrick Kelly in County Clare, because there are going to be a lot of Patrick Kellys in County Clare. But we may be able to find him if we have some more information, such as a baptism date or his parents' names. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But at least we do have a start. At least we would have a county. All right, a naturalization record. Now, unfortunately, a lot of Irish came during the latter half of the 1800s. So they came after the famine and up until and into the 1890s. So they most likely have the shorter form naturalization record that doesn't really tell you much. Those being naturalized at that time, it's just, you know, renouncing their former government and maybe where they were living, and that's about it. But if they did naturalize after 1906, they may have this longer form naturalization. In this case, this is an Irish immigrant, Winifred Golden, and she actually came in, I believe, the 1890s, but she didn't naturalize until the 1930s. So she has this longer form naturalization where she lists that she was born in County Mayo. So again, we at least have a county for her. All right, an obituary. Again, a great place to find this. In this case, we have Mrs. Ellen B. Hanley, and she, in her, according to her obituary, was born in Bancha, County Tipperary, Ireland. And this would be enough to put her in a parish, because Bancha is a town in County Tipperary. So we would be able to pick the appropriate parish for her. So again, this is in an obituary, so that's another place you can look for parish clues. All right, a U.S. Catholic record. So this is an example of a U.S. Catholic record where the bride and the groom are listed here, but on the form, it asks for the baptism location of the parties. And in this case, the groom was baptized in Limerick, Ireland. So that gave us that clue. All right, another one is a history book. So in the St. Louis County Library, we have a very large collection of county history books where somebody wrote, you know, about the history, the prominent people that lived in a county. If you have Irish ancestors that came fairly early, if they went to rural areas, if they owned land and became, you know, prominent members of that community, there's a good chance if there's been a book written about that area, they might be in it. So in this case, we have John Peters, and he was born on June 24th, and he was born in Skibbereen, Ireland, and he came to the United States in 1850. And Skibbereen is actually a town in County Cork, so we would most likely be able to place him in the correct parish as well. All right, another thing that you might consider is DNA testing and research. Now, this is actually my husband's, from my husband's ancestry DNA, but I want to stress that this is not typical. He has a lot of Irish DNA, and it just so happens that where his is from, there has been, I'm assuming, a large amount of testing so that they were able to, of people who come from this place. So they were able to really pinpoint his ancestors' locations in Ireland through his DNA. But again, this is not typical, so I don't want people to run out and spend $59 and get a DNA test. Mine looks nothing like this as far as getting this specific. But anyway, it does narrow his down to Connaught and to Galway specifically, South Connemara. If we look on the map at, that's where they've pinned it down to. And if we look on the map and we look at the darkest section there, if we blow that up, it's right down here. So it's not a very large area of Galway. And if we put it up on the screen next to a map of parishes, so this is a map of parishes from johngrenham.com. We're looking at the parishes that are in that area of Ireland. And if we look a little bit closer, it's probably only these right here. So we can kind of pin it down that way. And actually his ancestors are from Uachtarard Parish, which is right almost in the center of that square there. But again, this is atypical, but I still recommend, if you are interested in getting your DNA tested, even if you don't get results this specific, it's still nice to be matched with other people who may have trees on Ancestry, and they may have some ideas or may have already done some research on your shared Irish ancestors. And they may know a town or they may know a county that you don't yet. So I would still recommend checking that out. All right, so another thing that we can try to do is we can try to narrow down the surname. So there are a couple of sites, johngrenham.com is one, barrygriffin.com is another, where you can put in a surname and they will use parish records or the Griffiths valuation or different things to cluster where the surname is found. If you have done German research, I kind of call this the GeoGen of the Irish research. So because there's a site that does this for Germany based on phone books and actually more recent records. But this is an example of one that was done for the surname Fogarty. And you can see it is very concentrated in County Tipperary. And it even lists the number of hits for each county. And County Tipperary is definitely the largest. So if you had no idea whatsoever, you could kind of narrow down and, well, maybe Tipperary would be a place to start. This is not as useful for more common names. Obviously, your Kellys are going to be spread all over the place. And this isn't always, even if you do get a county, you still, that's probably not enough information. But if you can add some more, like I think I mentioned before, if you can add maybe the parents' names into the search or the actual baptism date into the search, you may be able to get results that way. And I actually have. So you can definitely try that. Normally, just to stress it again, normally just a name and a county is not enough. But with more information, or if it's an extremely uncommon name, it might work for you. Okay. Don't neglect your relatives and fans. Immigrants tended to stay together and chain migration was common. In addition to family members, you'll want to research your fans, which are the friends, associates, and neighbors. Okay, an example of this would be if you can't find the place of origin for your ancestor, but you know his cousin lived down the street from him, you might try researching the cousin's records in the US to see if those records had a place in Ireland, because again, most likely they were from the same place. So don't neglect those. And a great way to do this is to keep track of relatives, neighbors, and friends and things on a spreadsheet, like an Excel spreadsheet. So that's a great way to do that. So don't forget those relatives and those fans. All right, just a couple websites I want to mention. Definitely just Google Maps is great. Like I said, I was able to figure out the Glan mystery just by using Google Maps. So if you hear a term, and even if it doesn't sound like it's a name, you're not sure what it is, put it in there, put it into Google Maps, just Google it, even just regular Google. And you never know what you're going to get as far as results that may lead you to, oh, okay, that actually is a place, or that's part of a name of a place. So never think that something isn't worth pursuing when you hear a name or something like that. And then I mentioned the townlands earlier, and that may be a new term for you if you've not done Irish research before. So if you're interested in finding out more about what those are, there is a website, it's Townlands.ie, and it gives you a list of all of the townlands that are in the different counties and all of that. So that would be a good website for you to check out. All right. Some tips for you when using these records. Okay, first of all, the Irish did sometimes use a naming pattern, okay? For example, the eldest son was named after the child's paternal grandfather. The second son was named after the child's maternal grandfather. The third son was named after the father. The fourth son was named after the child's paternal uncle. And subsequent sons were named after the other paternal uncles or the eldest maternal uncle. And this was similar for the girls in the family. Now, don't think you have to write all this down. If you just Google this, Irish naming patterns, I think you'll be able to find it on the internet. But this is definitely something to keep in mind when you're looking, because when you have these records that have very little information, sometimes using these naming patterns can help you connect the people. Okay, be aware of name variations when you're looking at these records. Number one example is Latin names. So you may see Gulielmus used for William. So if you're browsing the records and you're looking just for W's, you're going to need to change that method, because you might have the Latin equivalent. Nicknames, for example, Nellie is a nickname for Ellen. So you want to make sure that you look for both of those. Abbreviations, very often you'll see abbreviations, for example, JAS used for James. Another one is interchangeable names. So there are some names like Bridget and Bedelia that are basically interchangeable, kind of the same name. So you want to be aware of that. And spellings may be different from what you see here. Your ancestors, the way they spelled it may be a little bit different. So Burke may be a little different. That's an example. And then another one is dropping parts of the names. So sometimes you may see the O or the Mick dropped, and O'Sullivan, for example, might just become Sullivan. And you have to remember that the Irish were under English rule for centuries. So some of this had to do with sounding a little more English and a little bit less Irish. Okay. Another thing I want to talk about as far as tips is some search techniques. When you are searching on a website like Ancestry.com or Find My Past, always be aware of that box that is the name variations box or the match exactly box. It's called different things on different websites, but you always need to be aware of whether you want to check or you want to uncheck that. I don't want to tell you to always do one or the other because I think it just kind of depends on the situation. I think more often than not, you probably want to leave it unchecked. But there are certain times when I'm searching that I do want to check it. So especially with some of these Irish names and with the way that they're spelled. So just pay attention to that name variations box. And then another thing is on these websites, I do this on Ancestry when I search these on Ancestry all of the time. You can use an asterisk or a wildcard when you're searching, which basically means, and some letters after this. And an example is if you're looking for a Patrick, you might want to just do PAT with your asterisk because that's going to pick up Patrick. It's going to pick up Pat, P-A-T-T, and I see that a lot in the records that I've looked at, the two T's. It'll pick up the shortened version, P-A-T-K. It'll also pick up the Latin version, which is Patricius. So definitely take advantage of using that wild card. All right, another tip is you always want to view the original record. Those of you who have been doing this for a while know that when you're using a site like Ancestry, the transcription part doesn't always match what's in the actual record. So you always want to look at the actual record to make sure that, you know, that's the correct information, that there weren't mistakes in the transcription. And also, you can find some interesting information when actually viewing the record. This is one that I actually found, and I'm going to pull it out here. Right in the middle of these baptisms from 1846, there was a line that the priest had written where he says, "A year of famine in which 400 died in this parish." And it just really puts some emotion behind what you're doing, to think that in this particular parish, 400 people died in 1 year due to the famine. So I thought that was a very interesting little piece of information that I found in the records there. All right, and make sure you note everything in the record. Pay close attention to the witnesses, to the godparents or sponsors, to the locations, etc. And we'll have some examples to follow on why you want to do that later in the presentation when we do our case study. All right, there may be times when you may need to look at other registers other than the one that you think you need to look at. For example, if your ancestor is located maybe on a sort of a boundary between parishes, you may want to check a neighboring parish. A marriage was usually performed in the bride's parish. I haven't found too many examples. In all of the research I've done, it's usually been people who were living very close to one another that were married, and they were both members of the same parish. But certainly this could happen, and if they were in different parishes, that would be in the bride's parish most likely. And there may be times when you may want to look in the Church of Ireland records. Since that was the state church, if you did have any Irish people, maybe former Catholics, who were wanting to maybe gain favor with their English landlord or something like that, they may have converted or taken their sacraments in the Church of Ireland. Now, unfortunately, the Church of Ireland records are really, as far as us accessing them, no better off because a lot of these were burned in that Four Courts fire when some of the censuses were burned. So these are not all available either. So just something to keep in mind. Okay. And one other thing to remember, there are some parishes that are found in 2 counties. So the parish boundary actually stretches across 2 counties. So just something to keep in mind when you're trying to place that ancestor in a parish and when you're looking at a map. All right, couple more quick tips. The female witnesses or sponsors that are listed on these records are usually listed under their maiden name, not their married name. So when you're trying to fit people together, that's just something to keep in mind. And then another tip is the marriage age in Ireland really varied. You see it at first marriage age. You see it anywhere between the years, anywhere between 20 and 30 years old, but they did tend to be a little earlier pre-famine and a little later post-famine as far as that marriage age. Okay, now we're going to we had the tips, now we're going to get to the pitfalls of using these records. Okay, so these can be very hard to read. Of course, it seems like my ancestor that I'm looking for is always the one that's down at the very bottom with, you know, mold covering half of the record. Here's an example of one that's very light. And then this is one of my favorites. This is actually from from the National Library of Ireland's website, and they just state the pages are in great disorder. So that sounds like that ought to be fun. All right, there are some missing years. So this is the parish of Kilcolman, and just looking at the marriages here, we have 1806 to 1830, but then we have 1835 to 1836, and then 1838 to 1871. So we definitely have some holes there, and that can certainly make going back frustrating, and it makes it more difficult. All right, oftentimes there is incomplete information. Remember I told you when we were looking at examples of records, I said this is best case scenario. This is worst case scenario. So this is marriages, and the priest only wrote the bride's and the groom's names. So we have no sponsors, we have certainly no parents, we don't have a location. So we have very minimal, very minimal information there to go on. All right, and the reason why that's a problem is because a lot of people in Ireland have the same names. There are many, many people with the same or similar names, and this is because there was a small pool of names that the Irish used, and they were mostly saints' names. And when you combine that with the fact that there were usually no middle names. So I keep contrasting this with German research, but those of you who have done German research know the Germans sometimes had 3 or 4 names. That can be kind of difficult to work with sometimes. You don't know which one they're going to go by. But this is the opposite problem. This is where you have no middle names. So you could have, 10 Patrick Kellys born in the same year in a particular parish, and you have no way to tell them apart because there is no middle name. So that makes it a little bit more difficult. I came across this fact once that said in 1864, nearly 1 little girl in 3 was named Mary. So again, that just highlights sort of the name dilemma that we have. All right, and I want to finish up with a quick case study of just showing you how you can use these records. So in this case, we're looking at Peter McDonough, and he was born in 1844 in Uachtarard Parish in County Galway. Now, this is actually the father of William McDonough, who was the immigrant. It's my husband's great-grandfather. And but I wanted to pick somebody far enough back where they were born before the civil records, so we would only be using Catholic records to find out the information. His son William was actually born in 1867, so he does have a civil record as well as a church record. But Peter McDonough, 1844, we will just be using church records for him. So knowing those two things about him, we're going to start and we're going to try to look for his baptism. That would be the place, of course, that we would want to start. So I'm going to pull it out here. Here is a baptism, and I'm going to let you know exactly what this says. This is September 10th, 1844, a baptism for Peter McDonough. His parents are Coleman McDonough and Biddy, and his godparents are Thomas Holleran and Margaret Holleran. Okay, so we're pretty sure that this is the Peter McDonough that we're looking for. This is the only one that was born in 1844. He is in the right parish. So now let's see if we can go back further. Again, we know his parents, we know his godparents. So how do we get back further? We want to look for his parents' marriage and see what information that is going to give us. So we're going to look back, 9 months and further for this marriage for his parents. We never know if we're dealing with the first child or, the 5th child or the 10th child, but that's where we're going to start, and then we're going to go back, particularly if we're browsing. Okay, so his parents' marriage is found here. And if we blow it up, we can kind of see it there. And I'm going to let you know what information is on it here. So this is September 24th, 1843. There is a marriage between a Coleman McDonough and a Bridget Holleran. The witnesses are Pat Lee and Catherine McDonough. So I said we didn't know where he was in the children, but it appears he was actually the first child. So how do we know that this is the correct marriage? Well, in the baptism, the mother's name was Biddy, but Biddy is short for Bridget, which is what is mentioned in the marriage record. And in the baptism, Thomas Holleran and Margaret Holleran are the godparents. And in the marriage, Bridget's last name is Holleran, so most likely relatives. And this marriage, of course, took place just a little over a year before Peter's birth. So now we want to go back another generation and we want to try to look for the parents' baptisms. So we said the marriage age was anywhere between 20 and 30 years. So we want to check back that far. Now, again, this is if we're browsing. If we're using a website where we're putting in the names, we would do that. But I recommend with all of this using a multi-pronged approach. Try it one way. If it doesn't work, try it another way. And hopefully you'll find what you're looking for. Okay, so let's take Coleman, for example, and let's look for his baptism. So we find a baptism right here for a Coleman McDonough. And let's blow up that information a little bit. So this is January 29th, 1815. There's a baptism for a Coleman McDonough. His parents are Peter McDonough and Bridget Clancy. And the godparents are John Lee and Mary McDonough. And the location is Ard Townland. Now, he did get married a little bit on the later end, you may have noticed, of that range. The clue that this is the correct baptism. This is the only Coleman McDonough born within the time frame, and it fits the naming pattern. So Coleman named his first son Peter, and his father's name was Peter. So that fits with our naming pattern. Let's just double check though and see if we can find some other proof to make sure that we know we're on the right line. So we look a little bit ahead. We're browsing and we look a little bit ahead and we find another baptism. And this one is for a Catherine McDonough. And let's go ahead and give you the details here. In 1819, there's a Catherine McDonough. Her parents are Peter McDonough and Bridget Clancy. Her godparents are Martin Clancy and Mary Malloy. And the location is in Ard Townland. So we have a baptism for Catherine. She has the same parents. It is found 4 years later. And one of the witnesses at Coleman's wedding was Catherine McDonough, his sister. So again, we found a little more proof to kind of tie this in. And I think what you need to remember about these Irish records is, since you have such a lack of information, sometimes you don't have the middle names, you may not have a location. Tying people together using these names is one of the ways that you're gonna, one of the sort of techniques that you're gonna have to use. Okay, and remember that I mentioned to keep in mind the Malloy family. So we have a Malloy as one of the witnesses, and we do know that the immigrant, Peter McDonough's son, did stay with the Malloy family, who they were relatives when he first arrived in New York City before he came to St. Louis. So we have that tie in there. And that's why it's interesting and it's important to kind of keep track of those names, because you're definitely going to see them pop up again, and they can tell you that you're on the right track. All right, so here's a 4-generation chart. Unfortunately, with the way these records are, I'm not able to fill all of this out, but at least just from that quick search, I was able to fill in Peter McDonough's date of birth. I was able to get his parents, Coleman McDonough and Bridget Holleran. And I was able to get Coleman's parents, Peter McDonough and Bridget Clancy. Now, unfortunately, Coleman McDonough was born in 1815, which means his parents, Peter and Bridget Clancy, would have been married shortly before that. But these records stop. So I'm not able to find a marriage for Peter McDonough and Bridget Clancy. But again, I was able to fill in 3 columns of this 4-generation chart. So I would consider that a success for sure. All right, and I want to wish everyone luck with their searching in these Irish parish records. Again, I hope that I have given you a little more insight into them. If you've not used them before, I hope this will inspire you to go and take a look. And I think Betty might come back on if anybody has any questions.
Yes, we have a few questions. Okay. Would you please read the list again of the other sites to find the records other than Ancestry, Find My Site, and National Library?
Family search. And I think I'm going to have to go back. Here. Hold on just a second. Let me go back and I'll put that back up there, and I'll leave it up there for a minute if anybody wants to jot those down. I have not been able to confirm if these actually have complete records on them. They might just be certain parishes, and there they are. Roots Ireland, Irish Genealogy, and Family Search as well.
Thank you. Another question, are the records in North Ireland any better? Any better? Not that I'm aware of. I think the Catholic records in Northern Ireland are pretty much the same. My colleague that I spoke about a couple times, he's been looking for his Catholics in Northern Ireland, and I think what he's encountered is pretty much the same. It's pretty much the same all over the island as far as what you find. And the last question I have right now, on the case study, how did you document all the steps you took to find out the family tree information? What form was the documentation in?
Well, I didn't put that in here, but I would probably use just the standard. My go-to is the Elizabeth Shown Mills book for documentation. So I would use that when doing my citations. But I didn't put all that in the presentation because I guess I thought that would take up too much space. but if you don't use that book, that's my go-to. The Elizabeth Shown Mills. I can't think right now of what the title is exactly.
Evidence Explained.
Evidence Explained. That's it. That's my go-to. So I would recommend that one. Betty
Graham suggested I repeat that Jack posted the handout in the chat.
Yes, and
Yeah,
it
we
pretty
came
much,
up
it pretty much followed along. The presentation pretty much followed along with that handout, which is kind of an outline. So if you missed anything in the presentation, it might be in that handout. And then I don't know, do you have these up available for viewing afterwards or no?
If you gave permission, yes.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Thank you very much, Robin.
Oh, thank you all. It was very nice to be here, and I hoped I was helpful. Hopefully I could help you out today.
Thanks again, Robin.
Uh-huh. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Robin. It was great.
Thank you.